Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. This is part 2 of a fun, fascinating conversation with Martie Haselton, an evolutionary psychologist, and Shane Mauss, a comic who is a student of evolutionary psychology. If you haven't listened to part 1, stop here and please listen first. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Let's get started with part 2. So is it the case that this sort of rise of single culture, let's talk about it in those sort of terms, is likely to be kind of an overriding, is culture overriding, technology and culture and the intersection and development of those things overriding what might typically be an evolutionary drive? Or is there, I am not an expert in this, but are there varied sort of...
I think probably both of the things that you're saying are true. Okay. So I think that we are equipped with the way that my PhD mentor put it was a menu of sexual strategies.
Yes,
and
okay,
so, you know, you can kind of look through the menu and decide which of those you're going to pursue. Now, of course, the way to think about it from a functional and evolutionary perspective is to think about what kind of environment you're in, what kind of problem you're facing, and then what sort of mate choice makes sense from that, or no mate choice makes sense from that. So if you are the woman who's paired with who's a 5, who's paired with another mate who's a 5, and you get that 10 opportunity, that is a particular kind of context that's going to yield one mating strategy. A different context altogether would be that, okay, let's say that you're the 5 and the 5, but for either of you to leave that relationship, you would be in some sort of peril. Maybe you are in that relationship living very close to the margins.
Threat of violence
somebody
and
leaves,
so on.
Threat of violence. Somebody leaves, then it's complete economic collapse of the family and so on.
Yes.
So
you marry a gambling addict. Get out.
Yeah. So, and then foregoing reproduction so that you can work on growing up and growing a strong, large body, maybe achieving some modicum of status in your environment. And so you're not trying to conquer the mating problem at that particular point in time, but rather you have the motivation to increase your social standing. So we have competing motivations, and sometimes we can trade them off at various points in our lives and then do sort of check all those boxes eventually. Or maybe one of those motivations
just overrides,
yes, or it wins out. So one is no less evolved than the other. It's just that we have a variety of motivations. And then you add to that some cultural innovations like birth control and like the ability to inherit wealth. So we're not so dependent on another individual for and acquiring wealth ourselves. Yeah,
the right to vote, access to education, all of the things that you've seen in terms of the rise of women economically, especially in the United States, right? Which has allowed greater freedom and choices that exist. So in a previous episode, we tried to answer the question, what is a remarkable life? And I put forth a model that I like to use, which is Martin Seligman's PERMA model, in terms of, what are the goals that you have in terms of living a good life? So, our evolutionary ancestors, to my knowledge, didn't have the pursuit of creativity as something that drove them as much as it is today, right? Making a podcast, making art, and so on.
I think they're making art and dancing.
Yeah,
maybe.
I mean, it was still impressive, right? Show off your big brain, impress a mate.
Yeah, but I don't think that the pursuit of engagement, as in the PERMA model, that's the E, has to be to get laid. Right? That it's
not
satisfying in of itself. Well, that it can be satisfying in itself, that you can do it as a hermit and be compelled by it.
I think that when birds dance, from our point of view, it's like, well, that bird is clearly impressing this female. But from their point of view, it might just be like, I don't know what it is. I just love dancing whenever ladies
Okay, that's fine. But certainly the opportunities to engage in art and creative activities are infinite now because of language, for example, and so on. Right? Apes can't write poems.
Yeah. But
they can use creative tool use and stuff.
Okay, that's fair.
Press.
Okay, but all right, but part of the point of this though are these goals which get crowded out by these parasitic children, to use someone else's term.
Yeah.
So the idea essentially is we have limited resources in the world, and then if you do pair bond and have your 2.5 children, it doesn't have to be the case. It doesn't have to be zero sum, but it crowds out some of these other activities that are enjoyable.
Yeah.
And that might be building a business, right? You know, like, it's harder to do science, you know, when you have to split time between your lab and a family.
Right. So the question might be, why are those things enjoyable in the first place? And so how did it come to be the case that our species was so interested in displaying their creative intelligence? And might that have evolved because it actually achieved us some status. It achieved us some attractiveness in the eyes of others. And so it actually, in those ancestral environments, it would have resulted in greater chances of reproduction.
That's fair. Before you say this, so I get that, but at some point, has to clearly be the case, is that these things become disconnected, right? In the same way that you masturbate for pleasure, not, you know what I mean, that you may write poems for the pleasure of writing poems rather than having children. Once the pleasure
machinery is there, then we will exploit it however we can.
Yeah, or whether the status machinery is there, right? I want to build a business, but I'm not doing it because, right? You know what I mean? So the idea essentially is that, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a great irony here, which is, let's suppose you do pursue remarkable things. Okay. And as a result of it, you become a more appealing mate.
Yeah.
Right. You know, so you're not playing video games, you're playing guitar, you know, and, you're not watching football, you're building a business, right? You know, these kinds of things. And, you know, you're seeing the world, you're doing, you know, like you're doing things that create status, that make you interesting, and, maybe you weren't even doing it for that reason, or maybe you were doing it for that reason. I joke that a lot of men do a lot of things just to be appealing to women. But suppose you're just doing for pure interest. And then, because you become more appealing, you can get that 10 rather than the 5. And then you pair up. And then the pressure either becomes, oh, I can't do all these things, or your partner goes, why are you traveling all the time? Why are you writing all these poems? You know what I mean? And that there's this sort of irony in that.
Yeah, I mean,
sense.
that's a very interesting point.
I mean, my podcast, here we are, I go around interviewing scientists, and if you were to ask me where this drive came from, I would tell you that, the only really related mating stuff was that I was confused about trying to understand, like, new relationships and why I went through a breakup, understanding why I do the things that I do. But then more generally, I'm just really curious. I want to know more. I've always been really curious about life, and was also frustrated by my religious upbringing. It didn't make sense to me. I give you all these reasons. And I would never say that I'm doing it to get laid, but I do also cast like a pretty nice net out there. And there are like listeners that sometimes come to shows that are like attractive women that are like, really, we think in much the same way. We have the same interests. And so it is tough to say like, well, that's just a nice little byproduct. When you look around at every other species and see that like most of that kind of artistic stuff seems very, very related to
I'm buying both of yours argument, right? I'm certainly I'm going to take a strong approach here, because I have a lot of data that suggests that people aren't, as you keep using the term, pair bonding the way they used to.
Right.
And so there may be these incentives to build resources or to work out, to look good and to eat well and to do all these kinds of things. There are these sort of proximal reasons to do this, which is I eat well and I work out to fuel my body in a way to feel good, to excel in the work that I do, to live a more pleasurable, engaged, energetic life. It may also have this effect of making me 5% more attractive than would it be otherwise.
Yeah.
And so, but my point is that these things can become, they're sort of, as we've moved away from our ancestral past, they become more disconnected. You know, like you don't.
They do in terms of the connection from, you know, the causal connection from A to B.
Yes.
That is, you become more attractive and then you have more offspring. But in terms of the motivation and understanding where the motivation came from, you know, can we really say that doesn't have anything to do with mating if that was the feedback that throughout our evolutionary history produced that creative motivation?
That's
was
fair.
that it actually did result in greater reproduction?
Okay. That's fine. Hold on. Because that's fine, except we don't just exist to procreate.
Oh, yeah, we need to survive long enough to procreate. And then it's also inclusive fitness, which is taking care of your young.
What I'm saying is that, like, you can obviously we make decisions to not procreate. Men get vasectomies, women get IUDs. You know, we also have people who are not engaged in heterosexual sex, and, you know, and so on. And so that may underlie our motivations, and it certainly shapes our culture. There's no doubt that it shapes our culture, and the things that we are sort of become more interested in, so on. But again, my argument is it's not the primary goal for.
Lest I remind you, both you and I are evolutionary dead ends. So this is all well and nice to talk about now, but if we then, like, if humans evolve enough of a psychology to be like, yeah, these things are too costly. Now that I have this, these systems that have been built to, like, be artistic or be creative or be remarkable or whatever, now I'm going to go off and do that for my own sake. Well, it might be the people that, you know, in future generations do have kids are the ones that just didn't share that same preference. So that might shape our future preferences as well. Otherwise, there's just not going to be anyone here. Like, if anyone takes our same approach, you know, the world will empty out in a hurry. Obviously, we're a long ways from that. And,
yeah, we don't have enough listeners.
But I do think that the amazing, I mean, I think humans are the most flexible species on Earth, and incredible tool makers and everything else. And then in terms of mating, it's the same way. And so, but then you have these these cultural influences, where you take an area where, say, like, females have been being aborted for a long time, so there's more men than there are women. You might make a prediction that the men there are going to have to be more competitive, whether they're more violent or whether they're conspicuously consuming things more and trying to stand out by spending more money. And then you have, like, these bizarre mating habits of, like, a female having 2 husbands, and it turns out that this only happens in these rare cases when the environment is very the food is scarce, and usually it's brothers. And so these are, like, this is just another human being, and you could plop pretty much any human being into this environment, and evolution's built so many different tools that just one of these will come online. And it's possible that you know, that people like you and I, which I can tell you in terms of intelligence being a way of advertising yourself, being from Wisconsin and knowing, like, that people can get by just fine with a very limited vocabulary, you know, and do all the things. It does seem like there's an additional kind of unnecessary cost of like learning all of these new words. And it seems like someone like myself or you, we're in LA. I'm in comedy. You're trying to write, but we're doing things to stand out. And so there's these adaptive features that are kind of coming online for the very specific environment that we're in right now, but it's still evolved, I would say.
That's fair, but I mean, I think we have to be careful, and Martie, I really want to hear what you think about this. We have to be careful about saying adaptive is good.
Oh yeah.
Right? Because
that's definitely a trap.
Yeah, so right,
that's
so
logically incoherent.
Sweet things were really good for us back in the day, and now they're not so good for us.
Right.
Because the world has changed. And then the open question, I think, is children were good for us back in the day. Yeah. And then the question is, do they continue to be good for us?
Oh, yeah.
And my thing is, it's not no one should have children. Right. My argument, and no one should get married. My argument is it's overprescribed.
Oh yeah.
And so what I want to
I agree with you 1,000%. Bless your heart, Peter McGraw. I try to say the same thing to as many people as I can. Believe
what I want to do is offer an alternative to some person who it doesn't feel right to do this. They don't feel the pull to have a family.
Right.
They're not so good at relationships. They envision their relationships as being more short-term, to be more focused on, as you say, short-term mating and pleasure, that they're more varied, whatever those things are, that is just because back in the day it was adaptive to do this.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily...
Well, you know what? I don't even think... I mean, saying back in the day, it could have been that for any individual or for any particular slice in time, executing the adaptations that served the cumulative history of the ancestors before them.
Yes.
Yeah. It didn't result in a good outcome.
Indeed.
Maybe it got you killed. Mating is one of the most hazardous things you can do. So you can get a disease, you can accidentally mate with somebody who's already taken and get killed. It's you can die in childbirth. There are all kinds of things terrible things that can happen to you. For any one individual, I don't think that we could ever, say this will be adaptive in that, in the way that I think we tend to colloquially use the word.
Please, yeah.
And so I think that kind of all bets are off about whether something's currently adaptive or not. I think we just kind of need to take that part off of the table and just ask, how do we understand the motivations that we are equipped with? And I think an evolutionary perspective is going to be very important for those. And then how do we understand, given those motivations, and given our motivational systems tied to pleasure, how can we achieve whatever it is we decide as individuals living in this current environment we want to achieve best? And in some cases, maybe it is finding a mate and having children. In some cases, maybe it's something else entirely. But I think that if we understand if we can sort of, if we can reverse engineer our motivations, then we have more control over them.
That's great. I'm so glad you said that, because what I think a lot of solo listeners... And
I just would say by having more control over them, so we can decide whether when we feel like a particular impulse or a nudge, whether we want to understand that as something that maybe served our ancestors in the past, doesn't serve us now, and how to maximally exploit our pleasures now, given the way our minds are designed.
That's great, because I think one of the things that I think the average solo listener struggles with is that they are in the minority. Right. And so it looks one of two ways, is like, maybe eventually you are I like to say for now or forever, right? You're single for now or forever. And so what I think this conversation helps to do is explain the pressure that's very clearly there, where it's the default, it's the assumption, it's the question you get, and when you answer non-normatively,
right,
the surprise and the pushback that you get.
Yeah.
What you're describing is that this sort of, our evolutionary background has pushed, we still are very much connected to that.
Yeah.
Although.
And we may be motivated to get into other people's business, because a lot of what you just said was about the social pressures to mate and have kids. And so why would anybody care what anybody else is doing? And why would you get this question every Thanksgiving?
Yes.
Right? But it's because your kin have an interest in seeing you do things that would potentially replicate their genes, which they share with you. So no, it's none of this is in our explicit conscious mind, but rather if, you're encouraging them to find a partner, if you're steering them toward particular kinds of partners who look like they might be good mates and helpful in rearing children, should it come to that.
By the way, it's friends too can do this also.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have friends whose wives are like, Pete, I worry about you. I'm worried.
I always feel like it's just justifying their own crap.
Yeah, I know. So they may not be sharing your genes, but you have a commentary on the strategies that they have chosen by not choosing to do those things yourself.
Yeah. It's like an attack on what they do almost.
So I think that's a useful idea. What were you
gonna say?
I
was just going to think that, because this goes back to a question you asked Marty much earlier on, and I would have love to answer too, because it affects my life. Just like how does learning any of this stuff actually help you in your day-to-day behavior? And I think that, much in the way that I used to have horrible road rage issues. I don't have anything like it anymore. Maybe I've just gotten older, but I think that it was deeply connected with like really understanding the stress response system, and now able to tell myself like, oh, the thing that I'm feeling right now is this response that was adapted for other things, like running from a lion or something like that. And it's just a complete inappropriate signal and erroneous signal right now.
And it's hurting me.
And it's hurting me, yes. And I can cool down, and someone that's mindful, like this can be like, God, I want to kill my kids right now. Oh, that's just my adapted thing of like, this is this frustration where you want to take control over a situation, or you're becoming hyper aware of the cost. Whereas like, if you're aware of that, certainly wouldn't you much rather want to be, I think that you have a chance of cooling yourself down more than someone that's this
is an amazing,
I want to kill my kids, so maybe I should kill my kids, most people are just following whatever their like thoughts or whatever are guiding them towards without ever questioning them.
Anytime we're having conflict with somebody else and we could sort of like instantaneously shoot messages back and forth with that person.
Yeah.
But if we recognize that we're responding as if, we're gonna die if we don't respond to this giant stressor. Then if we recognize that there's a big mismatch between what we're doing right now in this moment, where we're trying to work something out with somebody we have conflict with, versus what we would have encountered in the ancestral past, then I think we can, put it down, call the person back, whatever.
Yeah. And then also understanding that like why we might not be perceiving the actual threats today. Like we haven't adapted very well for like really having a sense of like global warming issues is something that you like need to train yourself to understand. We don't have any tools to really comprehend what like global warming feels like,
It's not a specific threat in the moment.
Right. And in that same way, boy, I have concerns about overpopulation. I would love if birth control and vasectomies and everything else were just free for everyone that wanted them. I'm very much for the solo life, but I think becoming mindful of these evolved pressures and biases and preferences can, if you choose to, help you break free of them or pause a moment before deciding whether to take action on a given drive.
Yeah, I think this idea, this is enlightening, because I think that these effects are, obviously they're very real and profound, and I like this idea of like telling your aunt at Thanksgiving to stop acting like a monkey. And when she's asking you why you're not dating someone.
Oh, that's going to go over well.
You're like, I'm a great ape. Stop acting like that. So, I'd like to do a few things here, a little bit more rapid fire.
Lightning round.
Yeah. So I have some questions that I want to ask, and then I just have a few topics that I feel like are probably lingering in the air for a few listeners. So Martie, one of the things that comes up a lot is homosexuality, right? So one of the things is a lot of single solo people, maybe gay or lesbian, you know what I mean? And not doing a traditional marriage and so on. And so what is the kind of evolutionary view in terms of this?
Well, so there are lots of sexual orientations out there. And so there might very well be different evolutionary explanations for each of them. So exclusive male homosexuality. So we can start there.
Okay.
One possible so, this is an evolutionary puzzle. So this is a prime example of something that is a puzzle. It doesn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective. It definitely reduces the number of offspring that you're going to produce. And yet there appears to be at least a partial genetic foundation. So it runs in families in some interesting ways and so on. So how is this happening? So how do we understand how genes can continue to exist and not be selected out, these genes for homosexuality or that make one susceptible to feeling this way? And one possibility, this is the best evolutionary explanation I think we have so far, at least in terms of what's been supported, is that the same genes, when they are present in a man, have the effect of making him like men a lot, enough to forego opportunities with women. Those same genes, when they are present in his mother or his sisters, make her that much more interested in men.
I see.
So it has a favorable impact on the female relatives in the family, and it, for the male relatives in the family, makes them gay.
Okay.
And so the genes are themselves being selected for and perpetuated through generations because they have a favorable effect on one family member, but not the other.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So we can understand its genetic basis and its evolutionary foundation, but it's more complex than thinking about, how are those guys reproducing? It's instead what's happening with their family members.
I see. That's interesting. Yeah. To me, again, I like to point that to, again, in terms of the varied.
Yeah. And for women, I think sexual orientation appears to be set and not terribly fluid in men, whereas for women, it can vary a lot over the course of their lives. So it's a different phenomenon, and it probably has a different explanation. Women being more open in their sexuality than men. Lots of possibilities there. One is that women may have had to reside in households with other wives throughout some of our evolutionary past. And so maybe that makes women a little bit more flexible so that there can be more getting along than there might be otherwise.
Yeah. I asked this question in part because it does seem like a puzzle given the kind of assumptions that we started with at the beginning of the podcast. And then also, this is a group of people who I think generally are living a more solo lifestyle, although obviously, we're fortunately have the choice to get married if they want to in many places. I have a question from a listener that's related to this. It says, I identify as aromantic and asexual. How does evolutionary sciences view those who don't have the quote unquote natural urge to procreate? Whatever evolutionary functions might we play?
Well, so we're getting back to this issue of, the thinking about the adaptiveness of a single person's behavior at a single point in time. And so, but, so asexuality is actually something we've started studying in my lab. And so asexuality is so it's like your sexual desire is present in these people. So the engine is turned on, or it's like being hungry. You feel hungry, but then you look at the menu and nothing looks good. So that's asexuality. Aromantic is, I know a lot less about that. And sometimes people are both, but I think that's relatively rare. A lot of times.
What is aromantic?
Aromantic just means you're not particularly interested in having a partner of any sort.
I see.
Whether you're having sex with that partner or not. So some asexual individuals will actually have, a young woman who I know
a lot
at UCLA,
of married people who are like this.
Well, a young woman I know at UCLA who identifies as asexual. She's got a boyfriend, but that is her romantic partner, which is different from her having a traditional sexual relationship with that partner. She's just not really that interested. Now, she might do it because he's interested.
Yes, I see. There's a term for this.
Compliant sex?
Is that the term?
I don't think that's... I think it would be...
It's service sex or something like that.
Both of those don't sound very nice.
Service sex. Gift sex, maybe.
I think service is like...
gift sex would be more fun,
it'd be affectionate sex. Maybe it's because the other person desires it and you want to get along with.
I think there's a term is service sex.
But I was going to say that that again, going back to the flexibility of a species, you take something like conscientiousness and you take two people like me. There's going to be tremendous costs to being as low in conscientiousness as I am. You take someone like Pete, you're going to end up having probably some anxiety. Your friends are going to think you're a little overboard with the shoes at the door thing sometimes. And so there's going to be like some cost there as well. Most people fall in the middle. So there's like sex addicts.
Yes.
That like can't stop banging as many people. And then there's asexuals.
Right.
Most people fall in the middle.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's sort of clear to me, especially if you spend any time on the apps, and especially if you've surveyed a wide variety of these apps, is that the proclivities and what people identify as and what they're interested in is more varied than ever. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how much of that is that we now have more transparency, and how much of this is sort of fulfilling this, right? It's giving people license, then they start experimenting. Oh, I kind of like this. And then they develop sort of new preferences as a result of that. Let's keep going with a couple more. So this one's for Shane. So Shane, you taught me about the mate expulsion hypothesis.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things to think about. I mean, sometimes I get, as I'm not a scientist, I can gravitate towards some of the more speculative things that aren't necessarily as backed up by data, and I also, don't mind applying things to my own personal life. And I find it to be, as someone who's been a serial monogamous, who genuinely has gone into like relationship after relationship, like you said, like deeply in love with this person, like I found the one, oh my God. And like legitimately wanting this to be like my life partner. It was part of my frustration. I was like, why does it start that way? Why isn't it working out? Why, and this idea of this mate expulsion of, there's some species of bird that does do like full pair bonding, doesn't fool around and stuff. And then the only time they break up is if, they get together and they don't have eggs. So they're genetically incompatible. That doesn't mean that they aren't compatible with others. Doesn't mean that they're infertile.
Like the same movies.
Just one. I'm just saying it doesn't mean that they can't. It doesn't mean one of them's sterile. It just means that together they're incompatible. So evolution probably figured out some sort of internal mechanism to drive them apart so that they would break up and go and find other mates, because otherwise you wouldn't pass your genes on if you didn't do that. And so the idea is applying this to a modern world where all of a sudden there's birth control. So you're banging it out for, that is a science term too, by the way, for like a year or so. And there should certainly at least be signs of pregnancy by this point. You might have missed a few windows here and there, but there should be something. Mm-hmm. And so is it much in the same way that these birds don't know that, like, oh, we're genetically incompatible, so I guess that's that. They're probably like, he doesn't wipe off his feet before he gets in the nest. So he's like, I'm trying to put worms on the table. That's probably what it feels like a little bit to them. It's a fun little, probably anthropomorphizing a bit much, but it's probably a little bit something like that. And so humans are maybe, a year goes by or 2 years goes by.
There's no babies.
There's no babies. Maybe there's these psychological pressures like, I gotta get away from this person.
This guy's a slob.
And it certainly models all of my, it doesn't mean that it's true. It doesn't also, and even if it is true, it doesn't mean that it's an explanation for my life. There could be a variety of other
speculative
things, but boy, does it model my not just my personal life, like getting along with someone, but also the sex and everything else, the way that it changes. Like after that first year, then the second year is always like, okay, some problems bubbling up. Third year is always a nightmare.
Marty, you're smiling.
Well, I'm smiling because this is one of my favorite evolutionary mysteries. And that is, why does anybody stay together if they don't have kids? Because they should be, this should be a major alarm that goes off in the head that says, you need to find a different mate. You are not reproducing. Now, granted, we may have made a conscious decision, any of us, to not reproduce, but you got to remember that, what we want and what our brains are telling us to do aren't necessarily the same thing. And so throughout our evolutionary history, the alarm bell that gets you to expel your mate and choose another one would have been the thing that would have been selected for and retained. So why is it that we do stick together as much as we do? I think that's a really interesting mystery.
So what, but shouldn't it be the case that there are, as Shane was just talking about, a normal distribution around people who, right? Sure. There should be natural individual differences in, for example, how pleasurable sex is and how much,
how pleasurable cuddling is, how pleasurable, commitment is.
And so that could explain some of it, right?
Some of it. Yeah.
Right. And if there's enough variance out in the.
There are just a lot of people who choose not to have kids and stay apparently happy for a very long time.
Well, okay, hold on.
Apparently.
But hold on. You're assuming that having kids makes you happy.
No, I'm not.
No.
I mean, they don't.
So that's the darkest thing of the whole thing is there's no answer to this puzzle.
Yes.
Having kids isn't going to solve much of anything.
I mean, because
plenty of kids break up after they have kids. The number one reason of
divorce is financial stress, right? Yeah. And what creates financial stress?
Kids.
Is having kids, right? So I mean. So the fact is that people stay together is surprising to me, no?
But this is a reason that is hidden from our conscious awareness. The financial stress, we're aware of that, right? Everybody's looking at the bank books. Whereas, this sort of, uncomfortable feeling that we have with a mate after a little while of having regular sex with them and no offspring.
But is there data that suggests that that's indeed the case? Do we know we know it happens in birds, but do we have data?
Do we know that people lose interest over the course of their relationships and their partners? Yes. I mean, there's a honeymoon period and then.
No. But that is the same whether you have children or not. Right? So the idea that mate expulsion hypothesis suggests that no kid shows up and then you go, I must reject. Right? Because, but
then if you have kids,
if you have kids, then you go, oh, this is a good match. Let's just keep this rolling.
Right. But then there's other considerations there too, right? Because kids are stressful and financially stressful.
Yes, they
and
are.
all of that too.
Yes.
So you have to include all of those variables.
I know.
Plus there's just the roommate situation. I mean, I really like living with a female. Like, I will move in, like third date, like, ready? Let's get together. But then, there's still, no matter how much you like that, there's still the now you got a roommate. Now you're seeing this person.
Shane's high on the cuddling scale.
I'm
obviously
way high on the cuddling scale.
That's so sweet.
but now you have a root. So bonding, pair bonding, having a children, these might have all been favored by evolution, but there's still and humans are exceptionally social, but then there's still other pressures of the more time that you spend and having to see this person day in and day out, the more you're probably going to get on one another's nerves and stuff.
This is perfect because Louise asks a question. She says, my question is, given that single person households with the standard of living that we have, i.e. we live alone when we can afford it, are humans really the social creatures we have been painted as? And so I think if I can interpret this question, I would rephrase it as, obviously humans are social creatures. How much of our socialness has to do with needing to survive and having some familial unit, right, to keep us safe, keep us warm, till the land, and so on, that when you don't have the needing to keep alive allows us to express a greater variety of preferences with regard to how social we like to be or want to be.
Yeah.
And the landscape changed in like this unforeseen, like evolutionary, this is another thing evolution could have never seen coming, is the internet. This woman questioning whether we need to be social as being social, like through internet and able to reach out to you and ask you this question.
In a very weak tie kind of way.
And, you know, whether you are cohabiting with someone, you know, that you could be more social and be living alone because you have, you know, because you're spending all of your time out with friends.
Thank you for bringing that up, because that came up in episode 2. I talked to Bella DePaulo, who's
I'm so glad you talked to her. I was going to suggest it.
She's great. And one of the things that is found is that single people are often more interconnected because one is the sort of need, right? That, you know, that you don't have just one person who you can rely on for a variety of things, but also then you have opportunity, right? It's not, there's no one to be threatened by the fact that, you know, you're going out a lot.
And you're not just going to be social by default. You're going to be social by plan. And so maybe that's going to lead to a different kind of social life anyway.
Yes.
You know, you got to make those plans. You got to get together and go out and do something.
But I think the point in this question, underlies this question, is there was a time where it was nearly impossible to live alone.
Right.
And so even if you had sort of a predisposition, let's say you're a disagreeable person, right? So disagreeable people are hard to live with. And so, you know, and so you're disagreeable. And so you're just like, okay, I'm just going to live on my own, you know, or you have something quirky about yourself, you know, whatever that might be. Now you can.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who spends more time alone than certainly anyone in this room, and certainly most people on Earth that aren't truck drivers, maybe. I mean, I spend so much time by myself, and I'm very happy to, like, when, especially
James, the touring comedian, he basically is home free right now.
Yeah, and when I used to stay in hotels, and I stayed in Airbnbs, but in hotels, I would often, like, be getting a room service and stuff, and, like, not even going out. I wouldn't see people for, like, days sometimes. Consciously, absolutely loved it. Like, that was consciously my happy place. That was, like, by design. And then I realized that I'd have to force myself to, like, go out and go to restaurants and interact, because there were these other, like depression would start bubbling up, and I'd be like, what's this gonna? So I just had to do trial and error, experimenting with it. So you might be able to, you know, you might be able to go solo, easier than ever, but there might be like these underlying little warning signs that express themselves in like depression or anxiety that pop up, and you don't necessarily you're never able to connect the dots, you know, to what it's from.
Yeah. And I've been fussing around with this saying about solo, but not alone.
Yeah.
You know, like, I don't think this is not a podcast for hermits or misanthropes.
Oh, you're a very social person. You're a more social person than I am by a long shot. Pete's exceptionally outgoing. Like, when we leave here, we're gonna maybe have a quick bite together.
Yes.
And Pete will be like making conversation with the waiter and everything, and then we'll like get in an elevator, leave. And if there's someone else in the elevator, Pete will like start up a conversation with someone in it that we're going to be in an elevator with for 15 seconds. I would never dream of doing such a thing.
This happened the other day. I asked someone, I was like, "Are you famous?" She looked famous. So I asked her if she was famous.
Yeah. So this is just a testament of like, you aren't, this podcast isn't necessarily about being a hermit.
Yes.
It's just because it's called solo.
That's right. Let me do 2 more, and then we'll wrap up. We're not doing any bonus material today, just because we've gone longer than I would normally, and thus don't need it. Plus, this has already been so good. How do we top it with bonus material? So, Martie, I have one for you and then one for Shane. So when I was first researching this podcast, I was thinking about doing it for men only. And I went deep into the manosphere.
Oh, yeah.
And
it's not a pretty place.
It's not a pretty place. It really, and actually it's part of the reason I decided.
And the reason I know about it is because they're fans of my work. So I get reach out on a regular basis.
So first of all, I'll say this is like, I actually feel bad for many of the men who are in the manosphere. I don't resent them. I actually think that they need sort of more help and better information. And a different perspective.
Yeah.
But one of the ideas within the manosphere that I notice is this idea of being the alpha.
Right.
Right. So this sort of alpha male mentality.
Yeah, this is why they like my work.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to give you my view of this, and then I just want your reaction, if you don't mind, because this is a personal view, and this is one that I have developed in some conversations with a good friend of mine. And the idea is that this sort of alpha male, obviously it exists very clearly in the animal kingdom, and there's great benefits as well as some great cost of this sort of alpha approach, right? So you put yourself at great risk. You know, you're fighting and so
stressed out all the time.
Stressed out all the time. But then you also get this great benefit, which is lots of mates and, you know, and this idea of passing your genes along. And so some men look at that world and they say, I need to be more alpha. I need to be more alpha. I need to be more alpha. And as I said, in the same way that our modern day world is disconnected from that world, that there are other needs and other considerations. I think that a lot of men hurt themselves because having an alpha mentality, and these are my words, is giving them an incomplete view of masculinity.
Yeah, interesting.
And I think that while there is some benefits to being assertive and confident, I'll take that as sort of a kind of closely related to alpha. There's also benefits from being easygoing and sensitive. And that there are times when you need to be assertive and confident, and there's times when you need to be easygoing and sensitive. And that a man who can have both of those strategies and move between them as necessary.
He's the star of all romance novels.
He's not only is his romantic life is better, but also his social life is better, his work life is better, his emotional makeup is better. And that I think a lot of men would benefit from embracing what might be considered a sort of softer side or more balanced side to that. And I just want to get your reaction to that as someone who's thought much more about these kind of topics.
Yeah. I mean, so when I've thought about it in terms of, you know, what kinds of men can pursue which mating strategies. And the men who are the more alpha types can potentially have a long-term mate if they wish, or they have the opportunity to just pursue short-term mating opportunities. Whereas men who are not as clearly higher on the 1 to 10 scale in whatever dimension you want to measure.
More dominant.
Yeah. Then they cannot. They're just not in demand as much. And part of the demand comes from this idea of the woman mating up. And so, you know, not only can he could secure a long-term mate, but could have these short-term mating opportunities if he's higher up in the mating hierarchy. So that's that's the standpoint that I've come from. Just my personal view is exactly what you're saying is true. So if somebody is just being hyper masculine and in the way, you know, in this alpha male sort of way, but is so driven to compete and so driven to be at the top of the heap that
regardless of context.
Regardless of context. And you know, that just is, you know, I mentioned already, you know, it's extraordinarily stressful. And I would think that, you know, you'd be constantly stabbing others in the back. I just think that it would be a really difficult way to live. You'd always have one, you know, you'd always be kind of watching.
I think it'd be difficult to have good, strong, like male friendships because you're constantly competing. I think it would make it difficult oftentimes to be cooperative at work, and a lot of work, especially innovation, requires cooperation. And then I just so as someone who has thought more about masculinity as he's gotten older, and I have friends who have this balance, and they really, I think, not only they do well when they're dating lives, and there are good partners because they have this sort of flexibility that, depending on context and situation, to assert either one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who I think I toggle in between a bit. I mean, often when I'm hanging out with Pete, I'm like, yeah, I'll let Pete be in charge. That's great. I don't mind letting other people, but I also don't mind like taking charge when I need to in situations. I can certainly like command a room on stage and stuff, and I'm happy to like turn on that muscle when need be. And part of it's been finding a balance of, because I think one of the more ridiculous, worst strategies that you can do is to try really hard to be something that you're not. It's often a very false signal. It's often fairly transparent. A lot of people kind of tend to, put a very defined mask over their insecurity so much so that it only makes them stand out more. Like when we were talking about you and I being lanky, and we used to both wear baggy pants to cover up our lanky legs, but it only made it stick out more because we're just swimming in these things. And I think that, much in the same way, like, a big bouncer, usually the nicest guy around. He doesn't need to worry about proving himself to anybody. That's who he is.
Yes.
Whereas like the short man syndrome's a thing for a reason. They're really trying to prove this thing that they are. And it's just like, well, there's no reason to not try to be, whatever you want to be in life, but there's still going to be certain things that you're naturally going to be, are going to be a better strategy for you.
Yeah, I think, but to dive into this just a tiny bit deeper, it goes something like this. If you have this perspective that being alpha is good, overwhelmingly good, it can make it difficult to ask for help. Right? It can make it difficult for a man to the people who he is closest with, whether it be a partner or a friend or a family member, to say, I'm really hurting. I'm really uncertain. It's like, as I like to say, the patriarchy also oppresses men.
Yeah.
And so and if you want to grow, and if you want to be and live a good, healthy life, there are going to be times where you just go, I'm in trouble. I need help. I feel weak.
Or you actually can recognize those weaknesses, and then you can course correct. So if you are always having to posture as being the top guy and not making any mistakes, then you never have the opportunity to really reflect on where you've been and how to get to where you want to be next. Or even say, I don't know what to do. Yeah.
I think there's some interesting lessons of like what makes someone a man and what makes someone an alpha and what makes someone tough that I think is different than, I think being an alpha can be very different than like, Rambo that I grew up watching as a kid or whatever, which is if you look into the world of evolutionary psychology and biology and look at something like, say, a handicap principle, which is kind of the way in which you're advertising your fitness, is you're kind of conspicuously putting obstacles in your path. You're incurring costs on yourself in ways and then overcoming those obstacles. So like conspicuous consumption, like buying a fancy car, that's what is like an advertisement of like, hey, I have so much money, I can burn it right in front of you. In that same way, making yourself emotionally vulnerable is actually a very real sign of strength, I think, for many men. And this is why this is like Marty said, the lead character in every romance novel. Sure, he'll win the fight at the bar, but he can also get sentimental and share his feelings and write poetry.
I will say this for the male listeners. I think that being vulnerable is an act of courage. And because it's in many ways more threatening than getting punched in the face.
Especially in a modern age where it's like no one's actually fighting. And, and real fights last for like 2 seconds before they're broken up.
Right. So that idea. Okay. Last one. And this is for you, Shane. You once told me, this is, I think this might be your hypothesis about the bringing a lady flowers idea.
Oh yeah, we were just talking about this the other day. Have you ever seen anyone present this idea, Marty?
I don't know.
It's the idea is that I was just thinking about why in the world are we bringing people flowers, and I think
it's not just a lady, but just bringing people flowers.
Yeah, and I was kind of just thinking about. I think I was listening to like Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works ages ago or whatever. And he was talking about plants and the flowering, that means that there's future fruit going there. And then I was just thinking, well, future fruit also means future mammals going there. And then I was just kind of thinking about it. And so then flowers are this kind of clear sign of future resources. And then I was just thinking like, well, hunter-gatherer, like hunters
By the
would
way,
be out and about.
Wait, hold on, as an interruption. This is exactly the kind of comedic thinking that I find so fascinating. Right? It's why I have this book coming out, which is lessons that we can learn from the world of comedy, because comics, they just think about and live in the world differently.
Yeah.
They're just naturally so creative and innovative. And I just think like this, as Shane takes us through his logic here, it's like you get there either through deep deliberation that Marty does as a scientist, or this sort of puzzling over. Well, I noticed this, and then I noticed this. Okay, so
and I was thinking like, well, hunters certainly weren't just hunting, because there's also it seems like strong evidence that like bringing meat back from the hunt wasn't like all it was cracked up to be. And gathering was a bit more important. So they would have also been scouting new territory and looking for signs of future growth. And I was like, oh, so then you bring a flower back, and then you have this symbol of future growth. So the guys are out. But what makes it so much better is that, one, this is something you could do pre-language. Potentially you could bring this back. And, what's even a little more clever about it is because you're pulling it from the stem. It's like, it's something like, yeah, you know where this is. It's like a savings account or something. Like you have this resource locked away. You know where the lockbox is or whatever. And you don't necessarily have to tell or have the capacity to. Now you hold that information in your mind. So now people better like do what you say or follow along or be impressed by you or whatever. That commands something. If you're someone that's able to bring these regular bouquets, that might be that you have a good eye for these new future areas to inhabit.
Do you have a name for this hypothesis?
No, I'm actually surprised that it's mine.
Well, it might
I'm
not
kind
be.
of surprised.
Yeah.
I mean, every time I think I have
for sex hypothesis.
yeah. I mean, every time I think I'm like, oh my God, I just had like this great idea that's it's gonna change the way people think, and then I'll like interview someone on a related field about like memory or something like that, and they're like, oh yeah, that's already a studied.
I mean, someone may have come up with it,
which is kind of nice that I stumbled upon it. If I'm,
I have not heard of that before, but I like the idea.
Yeah. It's a fun one. She actually, this is a high compliment, because at various times, Marty has written down a couple ideas in her notebook. And I'm like, oh, is that something I said? I think it was just something she came up with. Well, this has been as fascinating as I thought it would be.
Yeah,
I recognize that it doesn't have like the same clear takeaway that some of my previous podcasts have, which are like about nutrition, where you're like, okay, I know exactly what to do now.
Oh, I prefer to make life more confusing for people. That's mostly the main point of my podcast, is be like, there's so much more you need to know than you could ever realize. And anyway.
Yeah, but what I do hope that a listener walks away from with this is that, I'm not sure I can articulate it well. I'll probably do it better in this sort of teaser for this, is while these ideas have like great explanatory power, that in many ways the variance in behavior that they can explain has decreased over time as we move away from our chimps, monkeys, bonobos, apes behavior, and that we might have these more proximal goals and considerations that drive us, and that those are okay, right? That's the idea. And that even though the culture and what maybe the average person's beliefs may still be shaped by those, that you may be living your own solo life, you may be making it remarkable, and other people might have trouble recognizing why or how remarkable it may indeed be, just because you're walking a different path.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to take forever for our brains to evolve and catch up with the modern world. But I think to be able to be mindful of these things and be able to free ourselves from some of the pressures that were for a cause that has nothing to do with you. I don't give a shit about my genes. No one on earth really gives a shit about their genes being passed on. Like, who cares? Like, most people don't even know what a gene is. I would need to take a genetics course again to really articulate like clearly what a gene is. Like, it's not like I care about my genes. I'm not worried about my genes. who is. And so knowing that your genes are also not caring about you and are also blind in this process, maybe you can ignore or accentuate some of the things that you like or don't like that are driven by those genes.
It's well very said. Freeing perspective. I like that.
It is indeed. Shane, I'm glad I invited you along. Martie, thank you so much for your time.
No problem. My
Big
pleasure.
Fan of your work.
Thank you.
And thanks to both of you. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.com. Please subscribe and share with your single friends.